Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'm here standing in for my colleague Jason, who has gone to his daughter's nativity play. I think he should go. What I'll do is to, at 45 minutes, I'll try to talk to about 40 minutes, 35-40 minutes, and leave some time for questions. So thank you to Andy, who has set this in. So a lot of things I don't have to cover anymore. Since April 2013, we started archiving the UK web. I'll explain how we define and identify UK web. But for a starter, this is one of the largest web domains, top-level domains in the world. We're the fourth largest. 28th December 2012, the .uk registrar Nominet announced that they had, for the first time, reached over 10 million registrations. 10 million .uk registrations do not necessarily respond or translate to 10 million UK websites, but still you've got an idea of the scale we're dealing with. And there are also UK organizations and who use a non.uk domain name to publish content on the web. How do we deal with that then? So as Andy mentioned, non-print reading deposit is not just about websites, but journals, books, and newspaper pages and other digital publications, which I'm not going to talk about today. Today I'm going to focus on how the British Library, or how my team at the British Library archive the UK web to implement non-print legal deposit. And I will also address some of the key issues, access being one, not just the fact that it's restricted in the reading rooms, but also the sheer scale of the archive you're looking at, how we make sure they're useful for now and in the future. So we started web archiving actually a lot earlier, in 2003. I think I arrived at this job in 2008, so it was about 7 years ago. So we started, when we started, we worked with other UK organisations. We archived the web selectively, without the blessing of a legal framework like non-print legal deposit. We couldn't just go out and start archiving websites because these are copyright material. So what we've done is to obtain rights holders' consent first. That was time-consuming and was very expensive, and it didn't scale up. But the good thing about that approach is that we ended up with an open archive, 24/7 on the web. It's branded as the UK Web Archive, and I'll put a link in there. Now we have the Legal Deposit UK Web Archive. We call that smaller selective archive the Open UK Web Archive to distinguish the access conditions of both collections. So we actually worked with other UK organisations, like I mentioned, the National Library of Scotland and Wales, Wellcome Library, the JESC, and also the National Archives. So the consortium shared infrastructure, and each of us archived content of interest to us. We also worked with external organisations, for example, like the Arts Development Agency and others, the Women's Library and others, to set up or to build topical special collections. All these can be seen nowadays still in the Open UK Web Archive. Since April last year, we started doing things at a much larger scale to implement non-print legal deposit. As Andy mentioned, this is a joint responsibility of 6 legal deposit libraries, who, reflected by the distributed access point and the underlying shared infrastructure. We also mentioned it's a much more comprehensive national collection. However, access is restricted to PCs and within the reading rooms only. Okay, 10 million domains plus more. How do we go about doing it? It's a daunting job, and we can only do our best to collect as comprehensively as possible. So what we do is a mixed strategy. Each year, we're going to go out and crawl all UK websites we know of and capture as much as possible. Just that you know, when we do the domain crawl, we actually put a standard or default cap on the amount of data we collect per domain. Otherwise, it will take probably forever. We need to make choices there. And in addition to that annual domain crawl, we also want to make sure that important content, at least in our view, in our curators' professional views, are captured more frequently and adequately. Because once a year, you can't possibly capture the changes take place on some websites. So in addition to that, we crawl in a focused way around events. Top of my head, we crawled this year around the Winter Olympics, is that this year? The European election, the death around Margaret Thatcher and Nelson Mandela. So what we do is we would identify an event or a topic, and then we send out the crawler to crawl only those websites selected by the curators, sometimes automatically as well, relate to that topic or event. And these typical collections are time-bound, so we collect it for a specific period of time. We stop after that event has finished. So we build event-based collections in addition to the domain crawl. In addition to that, we also have a list of, I think, about 250 plus so-called key sites. Again, we can argue what is key, but the curators have their view in terms of what a key site is. So we crawl those much more frequently as needed, as frequently as needed, in addition to the domain crawl, just to make sure that the important content is captured. And the news site, on the web, which change frequently, we actually crawl at least the front page as frequently as daily. So these are the most of the crawling activities we carry out. And in addition, if there's still room, we could, we work with researchers and curators and set up, more specific, smaller collections. That takes place as well, just as in the selective archive. So I thought I'd explain a little bit what is a UK website and how we implement what the law says is UK website. So fortunately, the regulations defines the scope for us to some extent. So this is extracted from the regulations. So what it says is that those websites, free publicly available website, using a .uk domain name, they are in scope. For us, that is much easier to identify. Technically, automatically, even without any authoritative source, if we just do shallow crawl and discovery crawl, we will know. We will come up with a list, so we can identify those technically. The tricky bit is the second one. It says it's made available to the public by a person, and any of that person's activity relating to the creation or the publication of the work takes place within the United Kingdom. So what that means is, if a website uses a .com address, as long as you can certain that you're certain that the rights holder, so the owner of that .com website, lives in the UK, then it's in scope. It's not very difficult, but technically it's not scalable. It's, end of the day, how long is a piece of string? That's the question we're dealing with here. So I'll tell you a little bit how we do that. So in terms of the .uk domain name, straightforward, but the complexity is that some .uk websites actually point to resources hosted on non.uk sites. So for example, IBM.com/UK That's the UK, the portion which belongs to the IBM website, which belongs to the UK office. They would typically use a CSS or style sheets, or typically use images posted on the .com. So here is to make it known. This is how we interpret .uk. So for to make sure that the integrity of the .uk website is maintained, we decide in cases where embedded content is required to interpret that web page, we'll get them regardless where they are posted. For the non.uk website, we actually use a set of criteria. As long as one of these criteria are met, then they're in scope. So for our first domain crawl, which took place 2 days after the regulations was in place, we really didn't have many non.uk websites because those were mostly identified manually by curators. Jenny would say, for example, this .com UK website, I happen to have corresponded with the owner. I know he lives in Brighton, for example. That's great. We have a lot of certainty. However, it doesn't scale up. It's not until a few months later we start doing things automatically. We currently, during the crawl process, we actually run a separate crawl process. When we come across a domain which is not .uk, what we do is we put that aside and check an external GeoIP address. If that's a UK GeoIP address, we put them back in the queue to be fetched. So in that way, we automate the process to some extent, and I'm very pleased to report that in this year's, in the 2014 domain crawl, we already have nearly 2 million non.uk domains. So that's a relief to me because previously, prior to this, we had no idea or no confidence how much we have collected, how much we should collect. So this is good news, and we'll continue to develop, scalable and feasible ways to collect this part of the web automatically. We also check UK postal address. That's mostly manually done, and correspondence I mentioned, and we also allow a bit of room for professional judgment here. So, typical example. David Cameron's Twitter page, is that UK? If you apply these criteria, they don't meet this criteria, none of these, but we know he's the Prime Minister. So we allow a bit of professional judgment in cases where, these edge cases, for these edge cases, so that we make sure that some important content are collected. So a bit of statistics, some of these Andy already mentioned. So last year, 70 days, that's about 10 weeks indeed. So we did our first domain crawl. It took place 2 days after the regulations. And it went well, so we're pleased, despite not being able to archive a lot of non.uk sites. This year, we're doing things slightly differently. We had more authoritative source of seed list. That's a list of domain or URLs you start your crawl with. And we started on the 19th of June. We had to stop the crawl a few times. We had some problems related to the software, upgrading of the software itself, the crawler software. We've collected so far, I think last time I checked, 42 terabytes of data. These include some viral content. We pick those up as well. And we also take a full-size screenshot of the homepage. We don't necessarily make good use of those screenshots just yet, but we have plans to use them for access analysis and analysis. So I mentioned nearly 2 million non.uk sites. I think we're about to terminate the crawl fairly soon. I think before Christmas. That's what we intended to do. So, we don't, for a domain crawl like this, the intention is to create or capture a snapshot of the UK domain. So we do not necessarily capture everything, every page hosted on each domain. I mentioned about default cap. There are a few websites where we put no caps on, like bbc.uk.co.uk is one. I don't think we restrict the data size on the British Library website either. So there are a few, but those are really based on the curators' recommendations. Right. Change of scale from thousands of websites to millions. I think I want to talk about the access paradox here. So there's no such thing as free lunch. We all know that. So when we used to enjoy open access, we had to put in the work to get permission. And now we don't have to do that prior to collecting someone's website, but the access is restricted. And also there seems to be, when it comes to access or usage of web archives, there seems to be a paradox between the so-called document-driven usage and the data-driven analytics, which I'm going to make clear a bit further. And also in our contact or collaboration with researchers, we notice some sort of tension. So when we put in all the curatorial effort to curate a collection with high-quality metadata, they'd say, that's great, but your collection is not relevant to my subject area. It doesn't have the content I'm looking for. And now we give people a large archive which contains everything. They go like, I can't find the things I'm looking for. Yeah. And also, the web has no boundaries. The domain name system is a technical infrastructure to help us manage the organization of the web. It has nothing to do with content. So when someone walks into the library, wants to research a problem, it really doesn't matter if it's a UK website or a US website, where it's hosted, it doesn't matter, but we don't have that. So when it comes to archiving the web, we have deconstructed it. We divide and conquer. Each country picks up your national domain. Even that has a lot of problems. How do you even define a national domain, which we have, which we have covered when it comes to the .uk content? So researchers say, that's great, but I want everything relevant to my problem. I don't care where it's hosted. So how do we deal with these things? So this is a typical example of how a website is conventionally or currently accessed. This is the landing page of the archived version of the British Library's corporate website. So actually, I should point out the first instance. You probably can't see, but this one. The date is 18th of April 1995. To my knowledge, this is the earliest archived instance of a website in the world. And if you go into it, and you can find a .au audio format, which is a recording of a nightingale, homage to John Keats. I jokingly call that the first Twitter on the web. It actually works in modern browsers, to my surprise. Anyway, so this is how a web archive typically works. So you take a copy at a given time, and over time, you see how the website has changed. This is a good use of the screenshots I just mentioned. So in a sort of visual way, you can see the British Library's website has at least gone through three major design changes. And then you go into each of the instances, you look at the page one by one. That's great. That's the sort of distant reading a lot of scholars do. But can you do that in an archive containing 1 billion pages? You can't. So we started working with researchers quite a while ago, because it was just as a learning process for us to archive the web and to provide access to it, as them making use of archived web resources for research. through a few phases as well and learned our lessons. I think in the very beginning, we involved researchers in building collections. So, for example, if we were talking about women's issues, this is one of the collections we built collaboratively with the Women's Library. We involved, I think, a particular feminist scholar in helping us selecting the website relevant to that. We did quite a bit of that, and we ended up with specific but narrow topical collections, but with very good quality metadata and description. A lot of effort went into selecting these websites. And we very quickly realized that would only meet the need of a very small and narrow group of researchers. So we started working with them, looking at bigger and wider, more applicable research questions. So we ran a lot of brainstorm sessions, workshops, we had discussions with them, we surveyed them, and we noticed that in general there's a lack of awareness and baseline knowledge. You know, web archives, archived web resources is still not a primary research source for a lot of researchers. They don't know how to use them. And it's very challenging when you ask someone to articulate something which they don't know about. So they don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And I think it's only a couple of years ago that we started moving into a third phase, which is co-development of accesses. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and show you how this actually has even changed the way we collect and store data. So before I do that, I'll have to bring up a third data set. So we talked about our selective open UK Web Archive, open access but very small collection. And then we started collecting our legal deposit web archive since last year. You know, we already have over 1 terabyte of data, but you have to come into the library to use them. So how if we don't have access to such a large-scale archive, and if people cannot work with data in practice, how do we learn? How do we know what to do? And what kind of services we need to develop to meet their needs? So this JISC UK Web Domain dataset is extracted from the Internet Archive. It's a collaboration with us and the JISC, who through the consortium agreement of the Open UK Web Archive, they have acquired this data and actually asked the British Library to look after it because of our technical expertise over the years of managing web archives. So it contains all the copies of the .uk website from the Internet Archives collection, covering 1996 to, I think, 7th of April 2013, so the day before we started our own crawl. It has about 57 terabytes, estimated 4 billion URLs in it. So there's a research agreement between JISC and the Internet Archive. So if you want to see the individual pages from that collection, we can't provide a local access. People need to be redirected back to the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. However, it allows replication or extraction of secondary data sets. So since we have been hosting this data set, we used it to take part in a number of research projects, and also we have released secondary data sets for researchers to make use of. So I'll show you some very interesting results. The sort of thing people started doing with archived websites in its entirety, moving away from the page-based way, the sort of document-based model. So to start with, the JISC has funded 2 research projects based on that data set. One is the analytical access to the Domain Dark Archive project, which was awarded to the Institute of Historical Research. Another project went to the Oxford Internet Institute. They were intending to look at the linkages between government departments and trying to analyze that and see that, how that tells you about the relationship between the departments. So I put some links in there, so the slides I'll make available, so if you're interested, you could have a look at them. So as I said, some work has been already completed using that data set. In addition to the, for those two projects, we also have a student in Amsterdam who did an MA thesis, which was very, very interesting. So he looked at pages related to Margaret Thatcher in 3 different archives. So the Open UK Web Archive, the JISC dataset, and the Internet Archive itself, and tried to analyze how archiving processes actually impact his interpretation of a historical figure. It was a very interesting thesis. I mean, there are things he could do better, but nevertheless, that was interesting, but also useful for us operating in a web archive. We, ever since, made available a data set which tells you the format of the pages in that collection. You know, if it's HTML, if it's Word, if it's you know, Excel, or some very, very strange file format. And someone in my team actually did a format analysis over time to see, for example, how different HTML versions evolve and how image formats evolve and things like that. We also made available a geo-index, so all the postcodes in that data set was extracted out with additional metadata and put in a data set people can download and play with. There's a host link graph which we made available, which was extensively used for research actually by different researchers in the world. So here, I think that is from a historian who used to work in my team, Peter Webster, looking at how religious organizations, how their websites link to each other. You know, around, for example, events, if that changes, you know, and also these two images, that one and that one, is in that. I think that's from the MA thesis, and this one, also very interesting, is an Austrian researcher who took a slice of the host link data set, I think that's 1996, and looked at how the websites link to each other. I mean, to us, to me personally, I was very surprised and interested to see this around the edges. These are .uk websites which do not link to any .uk's. So they're sort of this. That's why they're floating around the edge. What that tells me is, in order to do our job well and archive all the .uk, or all the content in scope for legal deposit, it's not just enough to crawl .uk website. We have to crawl the global web, not necessarily keeping the content to identify UK content, for example. I don't know if I should venture to play the interactive version of this. This is again done by someone in my team, looking at how the British Library website link to and from other pages. So this is 1997. So I think there's only one website linked back to us at the time. That's the Edinburgh University Library. And then this is 2010. Things have changed. You know, the UK web space has got much more crowded. And this is Oxford and Cambridge. They have formed distinct blobs on the diagram because they typically would have, you know, subdomains hosted under their domain. Unfortunately, we know we link to these websites. We don't know if they link back. Again, there's a boundary issue because we don't have that data set. These are the non.UKs, so that's missing from our data set. The interactive version would show you how we depart from there and very quickly, dynamically arrive at here. I probably shouldn't venture it. knowingly. So when you start to archive website at scale, there are quite a lot of analysis you could do, which are not necessarily obvious if you look at web pages, websites page by page. So we did an experiment. We actually looked at all randomly. I think we took samples, 1,000 per year. We looked at all the URLs in the Open UK Web Archive from 2004. That's when content started to come in, and we start looking at how they are, on the live web nowadays, and did this analysis. So the dark blue on the top is those pages which are still the same. Well done, no changes from 2004 to 2013. We have the lighter shades of blue are similar pages. So we took checksum or digital signature of both pages and did the comparison. We can tell that some pages still are mostly the same, and we have a category which are totally changed. They're dissimilar, they're not the same anymore. However, we also have the missing pages. These are the typical redirects, 404s, but the hosts are still there. You still get a response back. And then we have a small layer, sliver of gray there, which are error pages. You get an error response from the server. You don't know what's happening, timeout or what have you. And the black bit, that's where even the hosts are gone. The server is gone on the web. So this is a picture of, just based on a small selective archive. Over time, we intend to apply this to the entire UK domain and do that each year after we've done the domain crawl. So we think this will tell us interesting stories about the evolution and the changes taking place on the UK web. I think many of you would remember this. So the Conservatives were in the press and being accused by removing pages from the Internet Archive. In this case, it's really not a conspiracy, but I wouldn't go into the details. This is a service we have developed to actually address the issue of deconstructed web. So we only archive the UK pages, the French only archive the .fr, the Danish .dk. That doesn't help a researcher. How do we get around that problem? So this is a small service we've developed using a protocol called the Memento, which is developed, the technology is developed by the US National Autonomous Lab. What it does, basically, is to allow you to browse past versions of the web as if you're using your browser. So it's an existing dimension or parameter of the HTTP protocol, but it wasn't used by common browsers. What this does, a cut long story short, if you go to the Open UK Web Archive homepage and click on Memento service, so any URL you put in there, this service will tell you which archives in the world has a copy of it. So here, this is the Conservatives homepage. We can see that there are, in total, 1,366 instances of that web page archived by 6 different archives. And 382 from the Internet Archive here, and each of this will tell you, here's the breakdown. So I think the Icelandic archive has copies of it, the Czech Republic has copies of it. So what this does is actually showing you aggregated metadata from the participating web archives. This doesn't necessarily give you the full text. For example, you click on the Czech Republic link and try to access the full text. It will tell you, because of legal deposit regulations, you have to come to the reading rooms. But at least you know, if you're looking at a page or a website which has disappeared from the live web, you know where you can find them. You can probably make an informed decision whether you should book a ticket to go to Prague. You know, things like that. So this is not ideal because you still don't get the full text, but we think this is a step towards reconstructing the web, putting it together again. Just before I stop, I want to tell you about a major project we're doing at the moment with the Institute of Historical Research and the Oxford Internet Institute. This is funded by the HRC as one of the big data projects. What we're doing here, the British Library's role here, really is to work together with a group of researchers to co-develop a user interface at the scale of our big deposit domain archive to make sure that we come up with a service which can meet as much as possible a diversity of requirements by these group of researchers. So the model taken by the project is like this. So we issued a call for bursary holders who have come forward with the research question, which we intend to investigate, making use of this data set. So I know a few of them. So for example, there is someone looking at the concept of heritage and how that evolves on the web space over time. And there's someone looking at beat literature and the contemporary commentary and imagination around that genre of writing. And also there is someone looking at the evolution of Euroscepticism on the UK web space, someone comparing the UK Parliament web archive and the same same content in the data set, and someone looking at and analysing the web pages to determine the changes of the MOD recruitment policy and things like that. So we just had an event actually not a couple of weeks ago here at IHR, and these bursary holders actually presented their preliminary findings. It was immensely interesting and really useful. Some things we have not imagined have come forward. I'll talk about that a little bit. But the idea really is to look at what they're trying to do and come up with a list of common requirements and then reflect that into a user interface which would work at large-scale web archive. I think without going into details, I can give you the URL and all the details, but without going into details, I think a major change is that because of this increased scale, we no longer can catalog websites, describe websites as we used to do. What we've done is to move away from describing and selecting websites to actually focus on the aspects of archived websites and what we objectively can say about these archived web pages. File formats, their location, postcodes embedded in it, the author, and things like that. All this actually is done automatically. We use something called Solar, a Lucene-based full text index behind this to support the search and faceted browsing. So a lot of benefits there for us. I think I'll give you a couple of examples. I think the way we store and collect web archive has been positively impacted by this. I'll give you a very good example. When we did selective archiving, we had 30% of the people who give us permissions to archive their website. So Jenny, for example, selects 100 websites which she thinks is relevant to the European collection. We send out letters, we sometimes email them, we even call them. We get 30 people say, okay, go ahead. And we get 5% of people saying, no way, you can leave us alone. And then the rest of the majority of the people actually, we don't hear from them. And we have no resources to chase them. But one of the researchers said, yeah, but why do you only make available the 30 websites you have permission for? I want to know the full list of selections so that I can understand the intended scope. You know, the brain of your curators. And I can see if I can find them elsewhere. I can see if the live version of that website is still there. And can you not ask the curator to describe a bit more when she was putting together this collection, what's going on in her mind? It's those things. And then someone else asked, how big is your crawl? I was like, about 1 terabyte. Can I have access to it, please? This is a professor of computer science at the University of Toronto. I was like, why do you need that? He said, you know, it's that data set. I can get my students to query and to understand the trees a crawler follows to arrive at a website, and to think about governance of, you know, in terms of digital preservation. To cut a long story short, these are the things, these are data we used to collect, or we were able to collect, but we never made available. These are the things we could have made available to people, but we didn't know they were useful. So in that sense, I think we picked up a lot from our researchers, and we also understood for a web archive to be useful, we probably need to meet a lot of different needs. Distant reading, analytics, big data approach, both needed. I think we gained a lot of hands-on experience as well, and all these prototype user interface will be applied one day back onto our legal deposit web archive. At the end of the day, it also helped us get around some of the access issues. We don't necessarily, when you focus on the big picture, you don't necessarily always need to provide access to the text. People are probably not okay without having that last step, but just to look at the big picture. I think what we want to achieve is to use Web Archive in different ways to meet different needs. And we want to make sure some of the baseline knowledge and are self-explanatory, which we don't do well at the moment. From us, for those focused or selected content, we want to focus on national events. We want to curate collections, because we feel that's the best way of understanding time in the future. And also, someone asked about whether you necessarily need to hold that copy physically. Yes, for legal deposit we do, but it doesn't mean that we can't link to other archives. There are many of us doing web archiving. If someone else has an open copy, we can link to it. We can at least make available the metadata, the holding information, and also we need to offer tools which not necessarily developed by us, but all these network analysis. It's done using a tool called Gephi, But the sort of help researchers need is how that applies to archived web data specifically. And also we did a scan of open licenses in our last domain crawl. We found about 1.1 million pages carrying machine-readable creative licenses. In a way, we can make those available, we just need to decide that's the case. And also, we're exploring the access to metadata, secondary data sets, selected websites, still permission-based, but in that way, we can give people a flavor before they come in to the reading rooms, a flavor of what we have, what's possible. So for your information, I have put a link there for you to look at our collection development policy. And very importantly, 2018, the review of regulations coming up. Andy mentioned legal deposit law existed since 1662. It's not meant for digital collections. Some things are in the way. Some things don't make sense. We still need to continue to lobby to make sure that we balance the publisher's interest and our users' expectations. So that's all I have to say today.